Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. Welcome back. So this week we're talking about chapter 11 in our book. This is week 12. And we're going to focus on a couple of things. First of all, there's an essay due this week. And the focus of the essay is Japan. And I will cover that first for you. So the essay this week is really about using Japan sort of as a social experiment, because as you read the chapter, it starts with Japan, and it starts with Japan following World War II. As a matter of fact, the picture on the chapter first page is General MacArthur, because right after the war, the U.S. goes into Japan and runs the place. In other words, they install, the U.S. installs their style of government, which is very similar to the U.S. government, with a legislature and an executive branch and a judicial branch, but also maintained the position of the emperor, because that was traditionally important to the Japanese. Now, the democratic society, or the democratic framework that was installed by the Americans, wasn't perfect for the Japanese, in that it sort of was opposite of traditions of central control. And you'll read about that when you go through the chapter, and you read about sort of the Meiji, the old ways of doing things. But nevertheless, it's important that the U.S. sort of installs this Western model on Japan, and more important, that Japan adopts most of it. It's important because Japan can be seen as this social lab in some ways, sort of an experiment on how democracies can work differently than in the U.S. So that gets me, that's a long way around to getting back to the essay question for the week, which only has one aspect to it. And all you have to do is identify a significant difference between Japan's culture and the U.S. culture. And that could be related to gender, education, religion, personal ethics, behavioral norms, entitlement programs, and discuss how the difference has affected Japanese society or policies. So as you read through the chapter, the very first section is Japan, as I said, and throughout that chapter there's some social program things that pop up that would be appropriate to talk about for this essay. And I hope that makes sense to you. But just think in terms of like social programs. And you can also think in terms of like economic behaviors of the people. And that can get you to the essay, that can get the essay done for you real quick, if that makes sense. Anyway, there's that part. The rest of it is, speaking of Japan, one of the things you're going to read about is that after the war, as I said before, the U.S. comes in and helps Japan form this new style of government. And in less than a few decades, they're already talking about the Japanese miracle. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, Japanese manufacturing just took off. The economy just took off. And actually, I'm old enough to know, because I was a child of the 60s, so I'm old enough to remember when the first Japanese cars came here, like the first Honda, I'd ever seen before, which was a very much a novelty. And back then, in the 60s and the 70s, 1960s and 1970s, American manufacturers were scared to death because Japanese manufacturers were making these great new products, Honda and Toyota and Subaru and a lot of other products in electronics, and American manufacturers were being left behind. And that's really the beginning of this process of globalization, and especially more specifically Asian globalization that we saw in the 70s and the 80s, which eventually led the U.S. to start losing a lot of jobs. So when you read about the societies called the Little Tigers in the chapter, which are these countries and prefectures that just started manufacturing and producing like crazy, that's when U.S. jobs started to go over to the Middle East, or not to the Middle East, but to East and to Asia. So that's one of the bigger points to take away from the significance of Japan, because they were really the first ones to just rock and roll when it came to manufacturing, finding better ways to do things, finding more efficient ways to do things, and quite frankly, they had a more educated workforce, higher savings rates, and a better work ethic than the U.S. So that's part of the reason that Japan did so well, and that same idea with the same characteristics carried through to, you'll read about South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, Hong Kong in this chapter, and it's the same deal through all of those, just at sort of a later period of time. So, with that having been said, read about Japan, and again, this essay relates to Japanese social systems, really, and so I think it's pretty straightforward. As far as Taiwan's concerned, I think it's important that you read about Taiwan because I believe Taiwan is going to be the next source of trouble in the world. And you can relate China and Taiwan as you can relate Russia and Ukraine to some extent. China wants to take Taiwan. They feel that it's theirs. And if you remember from chapters earlier when we were reading about Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party and Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party, the Republic of China, moving to Taiwan after the communists chased them off the mainland. Well, that thing was never settled, okay? So Taiwan became this independent, what they say is the real China, while the communist China became, the huge Beijing China. And so that still goes on today. And today, as we speak, the hostilities between China and Taiwan are at an all-time high. Now, the reason I have this map up here, and I'm sorry I've been talking about this and not using the map, but if you can see my pointer at all, if you look down, right down here in sort of the lower right of the screen, you'll see Taiwan, and you see how close it is to China. And so you can also know that the U.S. 7th Fleet is down here and that there are all kinds of U.S. arms in Taiwan, and we still sell arms to Taiwan. So, here we are arming this island, and here's the monster of China. And, China wants to take Taiwan, and so there's all kinds of hostilities there. And I think what would happen is if China tried to take Taiwan and went to war with Taiwan, certainly the U.S. would get involved in some way. But in a more practical sense, for the day-to-day lives, Asian trade would be totally disrupted. So little things like iPhones and all of that stuff, forget it. You would never get anything like that again because of sanctions and everything else. So as far as a disruption of the world, not only the people, but also commerce, any kind of attack on Taiwan by China would be pretty disastrous. So pay attention to that in the newspaper and as you move forward as we get out of this class. So anyway, read about Taiwan. It's interesting. Read about Korea. Again, if you look at the Korean Peninsula, and I'm on the right-hand side of this map, you see North Korea and South Korea right near Japan here on the right-hand side, and you can see that when North Korea is firing off these missiles that you hear about in the paper, they're landing in the Sea of Japan or they're going over Japan. So, one mistake as far as North Korea goes, and it's going to be a major problem over there. So, again, this area is also ripe for trouble. And North Korea is interesting because, it's been under the thumb of one family since World War II, and it's still under its it's a family-run communist country is exactly what it is. It's a family business. There's nothing more. There's no more about it than that, and it's very repressive. And I don't think repressive regimes can last in the long term. So I don't think North Korea, I'm talking hundreds of years, can last. And I don't think communism can last in China or in Russia for that long because I think the people eventually always sort of break through and take control of things. So anyway, but read about North Korea, South Korea. The one thing about South Korea is that it's a manufacturing powerhouse as well. It's a very cool place. It's very democratic, although they have a lot of corruption in their government, just like we do. So the difference there is that many of their leaders have been indicted and even gone to prison, and apparently our leaders can commit crimes and not get arrested. So that's the big difference there. That's Korea, and then you're going to read about Hong Kong and Singapore. Again, two more of the little tigers, the manufacturing miracles. Hong Kong's interesting because it was a prefecture or a protectorate of England forever. And, that just changed 10, 20 years ago. And China's agreed to kind of keep their hands off of Hong Kong because it's basically a city state. It's a huge city. It's got its own economy, its own government. And the commerce out of Hong Kong is just amazing. They've been amazingly successful. And the Communist Party now is taking over Hong Kong and trying to do it gradually. And we'll just have to see how that goes. So anyway, there's a lot going on. But again, read the chapter. Pull up a map as you read about these places. And you can kind of relate better to as why they're really important. Again, consider that China, it's where we get all of our stuff from. And like it or not, the U.S. and all of us, we're consumer culture and we run on stuff. So anything that happens over here disrupts the supply chain, like we saw a little bit of that during COVID, and can make a mess out of things. And any kind of war or aggression with China to any of these U.S. interests over here could be real trouble. So it's interesting to know about it, and it's interesting and important to be informed as you go to the voting booth and pick your leaders and make sure you understand where they stand on their position in Asia and in China. And that's it for this week. So you guys can rock the essay. It's really easy. If you have any questions, let me know. Be safe. Take care now. Bye-bye.